So we just received another major win against a statewide magazine ban. Oregon Measure 114's farm's purchase permit and their magazine ban was found unconstitutional and struck down with a permanent injunction. Despite the state's current efforts to overrule the decision, they have lost once again. So let's talk about what is going on with this huge win. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think magazine bans are clearly unconstitutional, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Also, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Kershaw Knives. Kershaw makes some of the best knives available on the market if you're looking for a quality EDC knife. I carry a Kershaw Iridium knife every single day for my EDC, and I cannot recommend their knives enough if you're looking for a quality EDC knife. And right now, if you order using the code YT20Scholar, you can get 20% off of your order and free shipping on orders of $50 or more. So head on over to Kershaw Knives, pick yourself up a quality EDC knife, and thank you again to Kershaw Knives for sponsoring and supporting this two-way content. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we will be discussing a huge win against a state magazine ban and then also their permit to purchase. Oregon Measure 114, which put in place a statewide permit to purchase scheme and then also a magazine ban, was recently ruled unconstitutional and struck down in its entirety. The state court judge in that case issued a permanent injunction against Measure 114. This measure, which passed in the state of Oregon, creates a purchase permit that you have to obtain to be able to purchase a firearm, potentially have firearms and exchange firearms going forward. But it also created a limitation on certain magazines, where if you had magazines over a certain capacity, well, then those would be illegal going forward. They grandfathered in some possession of magazines, but your ability to purchase new ones would then be prohibited. In response to Measure 114, the state was sued in multiple cases. The case we're going to be focusing on in this video is a state lawsuit, and it's the Arnold v. Kotek case. And the Arnold case was a lawsuit brought by Gun Owners of America, GOA. So go support them, check them out. I have a link down below where you can donate and join GOA. Now, as I mentioned, we got a recent decision from a state court judge which struck down this Measure 114 in its entirety and issued a permanent injunction against this law. But despite that permanent injunction, the state of Oregon was given an opportunity to file objections to that decision, and also a hearing took place on those objections and also the request to stay this permanent injunction at least until they appealed the case. So a hearing took place at the beginning of this week, and we got another big win in this case. Despite the state's efforts, the judge has rejected all the state's objections to his decision, and he has once again found that Measure 114 is in fact unconstitutional and must be invalidated. This strikes again a major blow to the state of Oregon and their final efforts to invalidate this pro-2A decision. Now, when we've discussed the Arnold case prior, I informed you that the judge in this case extended a temporary restraining order, also known as a TRO, which barred the permit scheme from going into effect, and he also granted an initial preliminary injunction, which barred the magazine ban also from going into full effect. This was a significant but temporary win, which was in place in this case, but essentially prevented the measure from going into full force and effect while this case was moving through litigation. However, now the case has come to a head with a full ruling on the merits of the case, and the judge in this case ruled that Oregon Measure 114 in its entirety is unconstitutional, and he is issuing a permanent injunction against it. On top of that, he has rejected the state's 7 arguments for why he should reverse his permanent injunction decision. Now, for those not familiar with Oregon Measure 114 and what we're dealing with, let me explain generally what it does. Oregon Measure 114 first requires that anyone purchasing a firearm must obtain a permit to purchase. To obtain the permit to purchase, the resident will need to complete a safety training course, go through a background check, get fingerprinted, show a valid ID, and then only after all that will then a permit be granted. The second significant thing that the measure did is it created a ban on the sale, purchase, transfer, and possession of any magazine that holds more than 10 rounds going forward after the effective date of the measure. So going forward, there is a future or prospective ban on any magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Now, one of the major issues with Measure 114 was that there was no way it could actually be implemented by that original date, which it was set to take effect, which was December 8th of 2022. Now, in response, multiple lawsuits and cases were filed against the state of Oregon to try to stop this measure from going into full force and effect. There was this GOA case that we're discussing, which is the Arnold v. Kotek case. And then there was a bunch of federal cases, probably the biggest one being the OFF v. Kotek case. Now, originally in the OFF case, the federal case, the judge there put a temporary halt on the permitting scheme and essentially prevented it from going into effect for 30 days. but the magazine ban was going to go to full effect immediately if nothing was done. However, in the Arnold State lawsuit, the Harney County Circuit Court Judge Robert Roscio, granted an outright TRO, halting the permitting scheme and then also the magazine ban from going into full effect, which was significant. Then there was a subsequent hearing on the motions for a preliminary injunction. At the hearing, Judge Roscio upheld the order to temporarily restrain the permitting scheme from going into effect. Judge Roscio said in his order that it would remain in effect until he received notice from the state that the new permitting scheme was actually up and running and they had the ability to enforce it. Now, after that hearing, he also issued an order granting a preliminary injunction, which prevented the magazine ban from going into full force and effect until he reached his final decision in this case and ruled on the merits. But the question was, what would eventually happen in this case when he ruled on the merits? Well, we received his decision, and it was huge for those in Oregon, and it was a big win for the Second Amendment. Judge Roscio essentially issued an order finding that this law, Oregon Measure 114, was unconstitutional under the Oregon State Constitution, and therefore he issued a permanent injunction against the entire law. Judge Roscio stated in his order that the Harney County Circuit Court is issuing a permanent injunction under Oregon Revised Statute 28.020, declaring ballot measure 114 unconstitutional, thereby permanently enjoining its implementation. His order goes on to state that this court is preventing the undue burden of ballot measure 114 from being imposed on current and prospective gun owners who have a right to lawfully possess firearms for the purposes of defending themselves and the state against imminent threats of harm. So Judge Roscio ruled that Oregon Measure 114 was invalid under the state's constitution and must be struck down in its entirety. Now, in the order, he also gave the state of Oregon until December 8th to file objections to his decision and order. If they did not, well, then the order would go into full force and effect. And as we know, these liberal states, these anti-gunners are not going to let these decisions sit. So they did file objections, and that was filed, I believe, on December 4th. And then a hearing was set on those objections to see if Judge Roscio would in fact agree with those objections and potentially reverse or modify his order. So here are the 7 objections that the state of Oregon filed to his order. Now, at the beginning of this week, there was a hearing, like I mentioned, on these objections, and the question was, would the judge here agree with some of the state's objections? Would he modify his decision? What would come out of this hearing? Well, we got information that, in fact, he has denied all these objections. He has ruled against them. He's still going to rule in line with his original order. And also, he denied the state's request, which was to halt or to stay his decision until they file an appeal up to the higher courts. So not only did he reject all of their objections, but also he will not withhold his final judgment. So he has ruled against issuing a stay. Instead, he will issue a new judgment, most likely identical to what he has already issued originally in November. And then he's also, I believe, asking for some additional information and some additional language from Gun Owners America, who are the plaintiffs in this case. So we know that the state of Oregon is likely going to appeal this in state courts. They're going to just appeal up to the higher level. And then probably eventually this will make it up to the Oregon Supreme Court, and then also maybe up to the U.S. Supreme Court if the U.S. Supreme Court has not acted on any other magazine bans, maybe like the Duncan case in the Ninth Circuit. But for now, Oregon Measure 114 is still invalid as unconstitutional under Oregon's Second Amendment language, which again runs parallel to the Second Amendment of the United States. There's also a high likelihood that the state will try to get the higher court to also stay or halt the current injunctions and the permanent injunction that was issued by Judge Roscio. Whether or not that will happen, we really don't know. I would say that would be a drastic measure, because what would happen is if a higher court decided to issue a stay on the permanent injunction, well, then there is the potential that Measure 114 could finally go into full force and effect. That would drastically change the status quo, because Oregon Measure 114 has not ever been able to actually go into full force and effect because of those TROs and the preliminary injunctions. However, I will say, as we've seen recently in the Ninth Circuit, that has been something that has recently happened. The Ninth Circuit actually allowed for a stay, an administrative stay against an injunction in the California CCW case SB2, which I'm a plaintiff in. That is the May v. Bonta case. That was a drastic move. A court allowed something to go into full force and effect through a stay. So it's not unprecedented. It is happening right now. But again, it is still something that is highly unlikely, and it's just something that traditionally should not be ever able to happen. But again, you never know. So despite the looming appeal, I still have hope for this case, but for now, the magazine ban and the permit scheme is still halted under the TROs and the preliminary injunctions, and the state's objections and their attempts to override that permanent injunction order have been in fact denied. This is what's currently happening in Oregon. I know a lot of people in Oregon ask me for updates. That's what's going on with the Oregon Measure 114. You guys got another huge win. The objections have been denied. The decision is not going to be modified, and the protections are going to remain in effect. So again, if anything else develops, I will let you guys know. Also, if you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.